Nice to see you all. So welcome to Season 3, Episode 1 of Inside the Rookery. Today we're super excited and my inner goth teen self is quietly squealing, not too loudly because that wouldn't be very cool, to be joined by Justin Achilli, who for many of you will need no introduction, but for those who do, I'll pass over to him in a moment. As always, I'm joined by my fellow Rooks, and as always, our Patreon subscribers and Discord community have pre-submitted some, I have to say, excellent questions for us to consider this evening. Do join in as always in the chat and we'll bring up extra questions and comments on the screen as we go. So welcome to the stream, welcome to Season 3, and welcome to you, Justin. You can feel free to make a little introduction, as long or short as you like.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here. Yeah, I'm Justin Achilli. I'm the creative director at Paradox Interactive on the World of Darkness brand. I've been working on World of Darkness since like 1995. Yeah, there was someone who just came on the team, and I started before he was born and have been working on it longer than he has been alive. So in some capacity or the other. So
that's happening more and more to me at work. It makes me feel slightly ill. We'll get straight into the questions. So Zoltan has asked a nice starter question. If someone wants to start in World of Darkness today, where should they start?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started, and one of the things that we're doing with the 5th edition of the World of Darkness games is kind of paring back the volume of lore that is in them. So really, where should you get your start with whatever appeals to you? Vampire 5th edition is a lot of people's first introduction to the World of Darkness. But again, we were talking about, they don't always come into it through the TTRPG. Sometimes they come into it through something like LA by Night, the streams. Sometimes they come into it through, we've got a couple of video games out now, Blood Hunt and Swan Song. So their introduction to the World of Darkness can be at any of those given points. So where should they start is almost more of a 5th edition is a great place to get into World of Darkness as opposed to, grabbing any one particular game. That's also actually kind of behind our reasoning. We're doing Hunter the Reckoning coming up very, very soon with our partners at Renegade Game Studio. Hunter is a great place to get into the World of Darkness because you come into it literally being as ignorant as possible and then figuring things out about the World of Darkness and dealing with it. So, whether you want to be young vampire dealing with things on the streets or, neophyte hunter just figuring out, oh my gosh, the world is full of monsters, great time to get into it.
And how compatible, backward compatible is it? So if you wanted to introduce all of the sprawling lore that has grown up over past editions, are you able to do so?
That depends on how you want to do it. For, again, the 5th edition, we're paring back on a lot of what is presented there. But if you want to use that, 30 plus years of lore that's there, by all means, grab toys from the toy box and pull them over. For other titles going forward, like, for example, with Werewolf that I'm working on now, there are some more significant clean breaks, like X, Y, or Z, we're just not using anymore. And instead of transitioning away from it, we're just saying, this didn't exist. And, whether that is something like an idea that didn't age well or something that we're changing because, we're working with diversity consultants here, and if this concept we accidentally introduced is perhaps insensitively done, we're not going to refer to the old name. We're just going to use the new name. So kind of as a summary there, yeah, go back to grab what you want, and as much of that is as compatible as you wish. The systems are a little bit different. One of the things I know, Graham, you had worked on some of the systems back in the day. The systems are a little bit more streamlined, but at the same time get things that were, very dear to the 1st edition. Humanity is very much at the forefront of 5th edition Vampire, and so over time, through 2nd, 3rd, and the 20th anniversary edition, the focus went away from humanity and it kind of moved more onto, well, here's these really old vampires and some of them are on paths and it's really alien and look how different they are. And 5th edition kind of brings it all back home again to that, original edition kind of, hey, you're a monster now, things are different.
Rather than the path of what you want to do anyway.
Sometimes. I mean, obviously, a lot of what we were wanting to do there was show how different vampires are. Once you've been around for 100 years, I've only been around for close to 50 years, and man, I'm getting tired. So
Tell me about
being 2-3 times that long. So.
Yeah. In a long-running chronicle, which we did have a very long-running chronicle in Vampire, the paths were really useful. So we started in the Dark Ages, and we came all the way through to present day to Gehenna, and we also did flashbacks to like our sires and things in like the Roman era and stuff, and that was really interesting because we were able to explore some of those things about what happens to you when you live for such a long time. And it was a very different chronicle to other ones we played, which we did also play, where we were neonates in the modern day, and you're coming like, how do I used to have a job and I had a family and I can't see them anymore, and how do I balance that with the thirst that's inside me? They're really very different games and very different. Neither of them is right, of course, but they all offer what I think the beauty of role-playing is, which is a safe space to allow you to explore moralities and to explore concepts that you just can't do anywhere else. So yeah, it's interesting to hear you're coming back to humanity.
In terms of the systems that are there for the 5th edition, you can actually do a lot of that just in a different way. So if you wanted to adopt some more of those kind of monstrous perspectives, you just take a conviction that expresses that. We do still have some of the paths in the game. Like, for example, the Sabbat now has gone wholly into the paths, and really all that exists in the Sabbat anymore is basically these completely monstrous path following vampires, and then some vampires who they might not even make it long enough to get to a path, and the turnover rate for the Sabbat is so high that the ones who do stick around really are the fiends among fiends, and that's also kind of part of why we move them over to the role of antagonists. Since we do want to focus on humanity, focus on the costs to you as a vampire. Here's the vampires that even other vampires are like,
Yeah, and actually those vampires, those fiends among fiends, look at maybe the young vampires who are trying to be those fiends and kind of just have a bit of a laugh at how, childish they are in their concept of inhumanity and fienddom.
That's a hard part too, right? At some point you're doing something transcendently awful, and on the other end you're just doing this kind of mindless atrocity, just this awful thing for awfulness' sake, and moving that, I think, away from the players, are not focusing on it, for the players necessarily. Hey, you don't have to squick everyone at the table to kind of get a rise out of them. Was also part of the rationale there.
And that moves us on quite nicely to Roderick's question. So Roderick's asked, how does one create a community around playing monsters without platforming edgelords and unsavory folks? Sure.
Yeah, that's one of the things that Vampire did that drew me to it initially was that it pushed humanity. It showed the costs there. So Vampire is not about doing terrible things. It's about, inevitably, you might have to do something awful. And then what happens? So, your humanity drops. And as your humanity drops, you find it more difficult to relate to humans. And, if you keep doing that, you basically, the character becomes unplayable, right? You become a white, your humanity drops to 0. You're just this mindless monster out there that everyone else needs to put down. And so the important part of this question, I think, is creating a community, right? And so, even in the players group, it's a coterie. You are all dependent on one another, for protection against these, older, tougher, more accomplished vampires. But also, they're the only people you relate to in these modern nights anymore. So, as you start going down this scary path, or as Andy, let's say you're the awful one today, or tonight, right?
It's well known.
It's in the rest of our interest to kind of pull you back, right? We don't want you to drag us down. We don't want to lose you. And so there's this sense of helping each other out along their way. So even though, it positions as you are the monster, it's, the riddle has always been a beast I am, lest a beast I become, right? How much of a monster can I be to keep control of myself?
Yeah, that really resonates with us because, again, in our chronicle, it became a chronicle about family, found family as well, as much as, actual family, because we were vampires. We couldn't necessarily have a family. We could have childer, but we had we've lost Justin.
I'm sure he'll arrive.
I'm sure he'll come back. But yeah, I'll just wax lyrical about that and say for us it was a campaign about family.
Sorry, am I back?
I think we're going to
Yeah,
get
you're back.
I've got over here in my lap, and
Yeah. And
Yeah, so I was just saying that had resonated with me because our chronicle became about found family over the years, and that was a surprise to us. We didn't expect that, but you were coping with the upcoming Gehenna. Well, Andy expected it because he's a GM manipulator.
It was the plan.
Killer extraordinaire. But yeah, and then it became you weren't just fighting against Gehenna, just cause for your own survival. It became meaningful, and it became. In its inhumanity, we were on paths actually very human. And I think that's the beauty of a game about monsters, which we might come on to a question about that later. Apologies, Graham, you were going to come in.
No, that's okay. It's one of the things that we, when I was talking to the writers of the first edition, that we all agreed we wanted in there. It was they said storytelling game of personal horror was the subline there, and that personal horror came from the tension between what you have to do to survive and what that does to you, which I mean, you've heard me rattle on about the humanity mechanic and how much I love it, and that's why it's there, because to show that yes, you're a vampire, you can do all these amazing things, you can do all these horrendous things, but there are consequences, and that's the balance. That's what gives the game a challenge, because otherwise it's just a superhero game.
Yeah, totally. It nails down the core concept of what the game is trying to push forward. Without that mechanic, it would be, as you say, a superhero game. You'd have your cool powers, you'd be bouncing around. It would be a video game where there is no consequences and extra lives. Exactly. But there's a real story to be told. And as you see those numbers slip and those words change, everything becomes far more real.
Roderick put a little bit of a follow-up. So he was focusing a bit more on by community, I meant the player base as opposed to the PCs.
Yeah, I understood that to be the case.
Yeah.
And, I think it's the way to balance the community that way is, I mean, it's by establishing a social norm, an agreement about what is acceptable or not. And the edgelords and the unpleasant folks will get bored and move on when they realize they're not going to be indulged.
Yeah,
I also
taste.
I was just going to say, I think it's also from the perspective of writers, writing it directly into the books. You don't just simply state, this is our world of darkness or Warhammer and its awful chaos gods, or Cthulhu and their cultists doing horrible, nefarious things in basements, and leave it off there. You also talk about how best to express that. You have entire sections, perhaps, in your book explaining what is good and potentially bad about play and how best to rationalize those norms at your table and what your limits are. And I think that is something that, as writers, we can directly impact. And to a degree, I just from my own experiences with Warhammer, when we released the 4th edition of the game, there was an outcry concerning how we were now PC and we had far too many women being depicted inside our books. And we had offered the idea that gay marriage was fine and that the gods were perhaps one thing or another. And that part of the community that had been invested in that style of play were no longer being talked to in the way that they were previously. And on the community side, the community itself then gathers around. We can only make comment. It's up to the community itself to organize itself around those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Darker Days Radio says, I really hate hearing people moan about, but it's the world of darkness. Darkness is broad and not about surprising your fellow players with grotesque things, although sometimes it could be because it's broad. I always feel like it's a world of darkness, and maybe sometimes your players and the PCs are the ones that are bringing the light. It's not, it's a descriptor of the world, but it doesn't describe who you are. What's your feeling about the community, Justin? Do you think actually... there's a bit of a stereotype that goes along with certain role-playing games about the kind of people they attract. But has that actually been your experience in the time you've been involved in the fan base?
You can see it almost in the kind of eras that people have approached the game. One of the things that is really remarkable to me now, we know little bits about like different chunks of the audience, and so many of the new audience members who are just coming to the world of darkness, it's super, like, I almost want to use the word wholesome, right? It's very supportive, and people share art, and we've watched LA by Night, and here's a doodle of my favorite character, and here's a poem I wrote, and everybody likes each other's work when they share it on Instagram or Twitter. And even in the world of darkness, Darkness news every week, there's a spotlight that goes on, hey, here's some cool stuff that community members did. And so, when you show that the community can be positive and still the content be mature and risky and scary, those are not mutually exclusive statements, right? And so, if so much of the darkness is you need light to give it contrast and say, oh, if we don't correct ourselves, we're going to end up there. And you've got this community that also has like a really good sense of humor. Way back in the day, I used to push back on, I wouldn't let us print stuff on our end that was comical. There was this one kind of treatment of, here's the antediluvians all getting together around the table. And I'm like, hey, please pull that down off the website. But now, how people use things is different, right? From 20 or 25 years ago. And B, you know what? I really don't have any control over that anymore. So if you come to World of Darkness and this is what you like, man, share whatever you want on Twitter. Put whatever you want on Instagram.
Engaging with a community that was so very different to the one I had when I was working with Critical Role, for example, it was a godsend in many respects, because they're exactly that. They're so creative, they're so friendly, they're so giving, they're constantly sharing and resharing and doing fan art and doing cool stuff. And sometimes it is about awful stuff, and not celebrating it, but discussing it and engaging with it and moving on from it. It's just really good. I agree completely with everything Justin just says there.
Well, and I'm not trying to drag longtime players either, right? Like, obviously, communities grew up around this, and even entire forms of play. Live action, in the sense that big live action games wasn't something that White Wolf did back in the day. It's something that players got together, built an organization, hosted games. So there's always been this kind of growth positivity, right?
Yeah, that may have been me back in the day.
So just dwelling on Chris's thoughts, Kilishandra has asked, and it's kind of a follow-on from that. I always wondered at the title, The World of Darkness. It's rarely, if ever, much darker than the real world. Do you have opinions on this?
Yeah, this is something that I have had a period of, I worked on this and then I quit. Then I worked on it again and then I quit. So I keep coming back, right? I'm the weird relationship that the other partner keeps taking back. But this past time when I came back to work on the 5th edition, one of the things I really wanted to focus on is moving away from that phrase, our world but darker. There's so much now that is so grim and so horrible and such a daily just misery. I don't think people want our world but darker. So the focus for the World of Darkness now is it's our world, but the supernatural exists. So there's all these secrets and there's all these consequences and there's all these groups. So it's about monsters and the discovery of, as opposed to well, now this thing is all of it. There's 1,000 kids starving instead of just 100, right? And that's just this kind of escalation of evil that I don't think bears much exploration. Visually, too, one thing that helps us kind of distinguish between prior editions is Our World But Darker can occasionally, you can almost over-stylize. And so, when I look at this church that's over on the corner and suddenly it's soaring to the sky and it's got gargoyles, and the world suddenly becomes another place, as opposed to, here's this church on the corner and it's the same as the church that's on the corner in the real world. And so it feels more grounded, feels more relatable to it. So it kind of helps imply or impart a degree of authenticity. I think you were talking there, Graham?
No, I was just going to say that originally, don't quote me on this, but when the term World of Darkness was coined for the supplement of that title, I think the underlying idea was that it's the world where you play the monsters. And now it's kind of morphed and changed, and it's more about, I think, confronting the darkness rather than being part of it. But your mileage made it.
We used to talk about it and say, like, what's worse, 1,000 people starving because of a famine, or 1,000 people starving because of a famine that was caused by a vampire who, prioritize something over something. Like, that was the difference between the world of darkness and the real world, was the cause of the events. And actually, in some ways, it made it less horrifying, because like humans like to have a reason. It was actually quite comforting to think that if there was something that you could fix, you could actually fix some of that evil. Whereas, of course, you can't. Well, I mean, we could if we all tried hard enough, I'm sure, and worked together, but we don't.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to take a different angle, because I like to be contentious, and I'm obviously the bad guy of the group. And we have to do something about Andy. The Game of Thrones, I'm going to go in a completely different direction. The Game of Thrones was loosely based off of English and Scottish and a few other pieces of history. But what it did was it took all of the events that happened, and there were some truly horrific events that happened, and made them happen in a very short period of time. And I think, to a degree, for me, the World of Darkness and other games which went for those darker angles, beyond the soaring gothic and the change of tone, which I strongly support, for me, the World of Darkness took all of the bad and said, yes, it's happening here and now. All of the strung out events are happening here and now. But times have changed from when I was originally playing that particular chronicle. Now we're in a hyper-connected world where we don't just see all of the bad unfolding before us. It's actually happening event by event by event by event. And it feels like the Game of Thrones rather than a look back to history. But it's not. The vast majority of people are super cool. The vast majority of people in the real world are actually super awesome. Even the people that we might argue with online because we have different and sometimes contentiously different beliefs, when you meet them face to face, they're cool. And you're like, oh, you're actually a cool person. Yeah, we're all cool. And you sit down and you eat a meal and you realize that everybody's actually quite nice. And that for me was often the difference between the World of Darkness and the real world. The real world is, yeah, there's some really bad people out there, but they're super in the minority. And they may be in a position of control and authority, but they're still in the minority. Where the World of Darkness, for me, almost every stone you unturned, there was someone else in a rather horrible situation because of somebody else's greed or because of the corruption of the monsters that lay behind it or whatever. And the unrelenting potential for misery was always there just down the street, and down the street here, it's fine. You know, in fact, I'd say all of Edinburgh, it's fine. It's not a dark city. It's no World of Darkness. For me, it is a very different place. And so there, I've taken the bad guy angle.
But this is also part of what the games do allow us to face is, there are inequalities and there are inequities and there is injustice. And I mean, that's behind a lot of the rationale for framing our antagonists as well. Like, for example, Hunter, and a little bit in Vampire, this is the time of the Second Inquisition for vampires. And so, there is the entity, which is the kind of Vatican-centered monster hunters. And then there's the Special Affairs Division, which is the FBI's monster hunting arm. And so all of these antagonists, sound like the good guy. Oh, well, they fight monsters, but really they're not there to fight monsters. They're there to impose their control by fighting monsters. Monsters threaten their primacy. Monsters threaten their ability to say, we are the prevailing kind of perspective here. And so even in Hunter, you're not playing the characters in the orgs. You're not playing the hunters in the orgs. You're playing someone who on their own, awakens this drive. And now, oh my gosh, we have to stop monsters because monsters themselves are inherently unjust. And, the SAD and the entity, the Vatican monster hunters, they're still antagonists for you because they're going to try to throw you in front of the monsters, to kind of flush out the monster's den and that sort of thing. Because you solving problems, you might eventually solve the problem they represent there. And it's a slider, right? How much darkness do you want? But that's always going to be a question for each troop to answer.
To finish on there, I always particularly loved Hunter just as a concept because it takes the classic protagonist, but it's actually an antagonist from the game that everyone had been used to. The hunters of werewolves or the hunters of vampires or whatever. And so it takes the antagonist and turns that into the protagonist again. It's the next step on from playing the monster. You're now playing the monsters to the monsters. And I just always loved that just as a core concept. What comes after Hunter? The monsters of the monsters of the monsters.
But there's also the risk for the hunters. Like the hunter who goes too far is always the cautionary tale, right? The one who's like, kill them all, let God sort them out. okay, that's nope,
Yeah.
nope.
Yep.
Yeah,
Love
who are you to judge?
Mhm.
Yeah. So Dr. Ether has asked, what's it like writing games that try to remain edgy without feeling cheap, crass, or tokenistic?
This is a great question, and like we went over the questions a little earlier, and the thing that immediately stood out to me about this question is, at this point of the state of the world and in our lives, I think there's nothing more radical than human fucking compassion at this point, right? And so if you are able to see these are going to be the consequences of what I do, all of a sudden you can kind of share a perspective that someone else might not have thought of, right? If they only come into this because they've seen, oh, you are the monster, and it's a chance to play the evil chronicle or campaign. It's a totally fair question, but that's again why part of why I came back. I love the chance to take this look at it as opposed to kind of go deeper into the darkness where the legacy editions did, right? Here it's you are sinking into the swamp and get out of the swamp. As opposed to one of the terms we use on the brand team is the escalation of evil, right? And we don't want this kind of series of books coming out that's like, well, here's the Sabbat, oh, and here's the super Sabbat, oh, and here's the Sabbat, murderous death cult fiend. No,
dirty secrets.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we do want that sense of wheels within wheels and conspiracy, and there's always secrets to uncover. But what we don't want is, oh, these are even worse. Oh, these are even worse. Oh, these are even, it goes to 11 kind of thing. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially because there was such a plethora in earlier editions of lore and of clan books and then city books, and everything would have like something extra, and you'd be like it does beg the question, if this is so extra, like why haven't we heard about it until it's only just become available to our storyteller now? And it was always like upping the ante and having something, and Andy is very much a lore man in anything he GMs or is a storyteller for. So he always had to like come up with a way to like weave it back in and like retcon it back in.
Yeah,
The old power creep.
Yeah,
I think it's a problem that any long-running game or setting is faced with. It's how to top what you did last, and eventually you can just become a parody of yourself. Like the succession of Warhammer Army books with their bigger and badder heroes and more elaborate machines, and it's a problem.
One of the ways that we're trying to approach it now is to go broad instead of deep. Like in the past, the player's guide, for example, has gone up to like, here's the level 10 discipline powers. Here's what these, ancient blood god vampires can do. And now with the focus on, well, here's what, young vampires care about night to night, we've put a hard cap on ourselves. We've said, disciplines go to level 5. And so you can get these greater and greater effects, but they happen with amalgams, right? It's a dominate level 5 and presence level 5 and obfuscate level 5. So it becomes, instead of this, kind of ramping up power, it moves laterally and it becomes more and more difficult to get and specialized. And so, part of that too, the kind of accumulation of lore, like we're describing. Way back in the day, White Wolf was a publishing company, and the business model was sell books. And so here's the game books, and over time we introduced more and more lore into the books to kind of justify, as a value add to the book, buy this to read the story and to play the game. We didn't have great customer research back in the day, but about 50% of the players were buying to read what happened next in these periodicals, and the other half were buying to play the game. And so now one of the things that I'm trying to focus on is the game books are game books. They're focused on, there's much more dense information. Here's an antagonist you can use, and here's a power you can use, and it's all front loaded, right? It's the front of the book. So, you can get in there and use it right away. And then later in the book, here's how, there's a little bit more nuance to it. But in terms of building the lore, I see the lore as more of the role of, this video game tells the story of Seattle, and this game tells the story of what's happening in Prague this night, and this video game tells the story of what's happening in Boston. And so, it really moves it more into a transmedia approach, different stories told in different media, as opposed to kind of this the book has to do everything.
Right.
Yeah, that's
I
really
like that.
interesting. Yeah. It resonates with some of what we're trying to do in the Rookery with a system agnostic approach, because the GMs who'll be using our material maybe come with their own lore, and it's quite interesting. It's given me thoughts about how we present our stuff and how we could do it. What I'm hearing is basically we need to get into video games. That's the takeaway message for me, Andy. Just so you know.
Easy.
Yeah. So we can tell our stories there. So Roderick has asked, did anyone anticipate the way the influx of goth drama kids would change the face of role-playing forever?
Oh,
I love this question because I was that kid.
No one knew what was going to happen here. And one of the things that I think is absolutely fascinating is kind of that era of goth has a look, right? The kind of back when Vampire released, there was sort of a late 70s, early 80s kind of Susie and the Banshees, Joy Division, the Damned kind of look to it. So the role playing lagged a little bit behind the actual counterculture, and now counterculture is evolving in real time, basically. And so the people who are drawn to it for the allure of darkness and the beauty of the night and all of the things that just remain so true is happening so quickly. And so while the aesthetics are different, the kind of emotional resonance is there still. And so it doesn't feel like the 80s anymore. It's not the new wave era, and it's not the grunge era, because those kind of eras, those movements were tied to a time period, but goth and the appreciation of the gothic and its sublime and punk is something that is timeless, right? It's tied to an emotion more than it's tied to a decade, right? And so all of these things that drew the original goths to enjoy, and even going as far back as the Victorian era, these things that grew out of these kind of post-romantic ideas. All of that is still there, and it just looks different now, but its germ is still true.
Yeah, well, the feeling of not fitting in, of being other, of being marginalized, is timeless. And someone said in a review when Vampire first came out that being plunged into a world with new feelings and new powers you barely understand, and elders trying to hold you down, is pretty much adolescence in a nutshell, and that's never going to change, is it?
No, that's true.
That's one of the pieces that one of the brand values. Our phrase for it is "outsiders rule," right? Literally. So not only are you playing the outsider, but the outsiders cumulatively have this fascinating society. And another phrase I use for it is inclusive exclusivity. So, here's this secret society, this group that, the rest of the world doesn't know about it. But once you've figured it out, come on into the party, right? Join. You are one of us now. You can be a part of this. And so, if you are able to see beyond the veil of secrets, this is your home.
I always felt that. No, you go, Andy.
I was just going to say, I take a slightly different angle and go to the impact on role-playing in general. When I grew up in the middle of nowhere in northern Scotland, and I ran my role-playing clubs with far too many members for a tiny town, they were all boys. And they were all playing, broadly speaking, traditional role-playing games, whether that was D&D, Warhammer, Tunnels and Trolls, or whatever it happened to be at the time, Call of Cthulhu. And when I came down to Edinburgh and joined in with the building vampire live action roleplay, the difference could not have been more profound.
Absolutely.
Because the people that were coming along to these games were quite literally the outsiders within their own little communities. And they were pretty much 50-50 split, gender, down the line. And it was a completely different game because of that. Not just because of the material at hand, because of the aesthetic that it presented, but because there was a vast swathe of different type of people engaging with it, which meant that different stories resonated with different people. And as a referee for that particular game, the stories that I would have presented to groups of purely boys when we were young teenagers were not only no longer appropriate, they just weren't as much fun. The impact on the storytelling, the impact on the very games that we were playing was extraordinary, immense. It was deep. So running straight to that point, the impact for me was not just big in terms of the overall role-playing community, it was big in terms of what I made in the future. Truly huge. And yes, I was that goth kid. We appear to be having a bit of a sound coming in.
Yeah, there's a very strange background noise that sounds like a 90s modem dialing, which I think Graham is coming. I've just muted everyone in turn stealthily when you weren't talking. And I think it's coming from you, Graham. Like if I mute you.
Oh, yeah, it's gone. There we go.
It goes away.
Huh. It may be the fan on my computer. I couldn't get my headset working, so I'm dealing with...
We'll move along swiftly. So my conclusion on that one is, did it change for me? Yes.
I'm going to mute you. Put your hand up if you want to speak, and or you can unmute yourself when you want to speak.
All right.
If you mute yourself, you'll be able to unmute yourself.
Oh, sweet.
There we go. It definitely sounded like a modem. Anyway, sorry, I've been totally distracted. Yeah, I was very much. It was really an interesting experience. I've talked about this on a previous stream about how opening those books and seeing, coming from a very. It was before the internet really took off, so you didn't really have a view to the outside world, and so opening those books and seeing the archetypes at the back of them about the different people that you could be, and you could be the rulers, you could be the prince, and you could look like how I wanted to look, was really actually fundamentally, like, it was really life-changing. It genuinely was a moment that changed me. And it's really interesting to think, like, what people who are coming to role-playing today are coming to it in a completely different way, and to, like, nerd culture. I would have died to have the amount of TV series, streaming, and films that we have today. Like, I would be so excited. We live in, like, this golden age of fantasy and sci-fi and horror and all of those things. So sorry, I just went off a bit there.
I'll add one more small thing that it offered that no other game I'd been involved with offered. And that was, I remember the discussion. I felt extremely adult at the time. I was probably 18, maybe 19. And we were having a discussion about power and the power models that Vampire offered. And one particular player, I think she may have been 17, she was that young. We were discussing how she could potentially be the prince, and she couldn't understand it. So we had the long talk about how vampires are obviously stuck at the age they were sired, and how the power models were not based upon your appearance, but they were based upon so many other things. I won't go into long in-depth conversations about this, but what you looked like didn't matter. The long and short of it, your age and your apparent age didn't matter. It was the character that mattered, and the character that we're bringing to the table. And she was delighted. She could not have been happier. She was like, so I can dress any way I want to dress. Yes. I can do all these fun things. Yes. And I can be in a position of power and authority over these other people. Absolutely. It was for her a game changer, because she could suddenly express herself in ways that had been forbidden in many respects in normal society. And she was given the freedom to wear what she wanted to wear, to appear the way she wanted to appear, and to have fun doing it and be surrounded by other people who were also having fun doing it. It was, as it said there, a game changer.
That's also, I think, something too that I've worked on a couple of VR games in the past, and we did a VR game that was, kind of the same premise as One Night Werewolf, right? Like, find who among you is the werewolf. And we played with a group of journalists, and one of the journalists mentioned that, normally when they play this kind of game, they're withdrawn and they pull back. But when they were playing in VR and they were, portraying this character, that character gave them this level of almost a shield, and so they could do whatever they want. And it was the game that let them do this. And I think along the same lines, when we're talking about TTRPGs, you get to build that persona, and you get to make them look how you want to look, and you are signifying the things that, well, when I carry around this giant sword, I want to fight, right? Or when I am a prince who appears as a 17-year-old girl, I'm kind of wanting someone to underestimate me and then demonstrate my power over them, right? I want them to make their judgment, and then I get to have power over them because of their inappropriate judgment, right? And so, these that is part of the fantasy for the world of darkness, right? Is you project whatever image, and it is, it may be completely mundane, or it may be shocking, or it may be very, moody or subculture oriented, but whatever it is, you are intending to provoke a response with it. And so, I think that was probably appealing to some of that goth culture and gothic culture as well.
Yeah, totally.
So, Dr. E, moving back to Hunter. So, Dr. Ether has asked, Hunter the Reckoning, given the direction of the game, how hard/easy was it to retcon/abandon elements of the previous iteration?
For Hunter, it was actually pretty easy. Once we knew that we wanted one of the pillars of the game is that, you were always the underdog. And again, that's why you're not playing those org hunters. They have massive government money or huge church funds or, whatever available to them. And so one of the things that always was a point of contention for the Hunter the Reckoning, the audience back in the first edition, was that the heralds or the messengers were actually imbuing you with these powers. And so, you fight the supernatural, but you are supernatural. And there's varying interpretations of that depending on how much of the lore you wanted to go into. But it was kind of a mental disconnect there where you fight the supernatural and you are supernatural. And so, we moved that away entirely for Hunter. But if you want to do it, you can just kind of skin your edges that way, right? I have the arsenal advantage, or edge. And sometimes it means I have this gun and it's a family heirloom, or sometimes it means if I want to, I woke up and an angel left this gun on the nightstand. And so I picked it up and I am righteously doing this. And so, however you want to do it, it's a very skin it as you wish. And again, kind of put on those signifiers, build your character around how you want to be perceived. So for Hunter, not easy, but very direct. For Werewolf, on the other hand, which is what I'm working on now, I've been working on Werewolf longer than I've been working on Hunter, and it's taken more time to do it because when you pull something out that you don't want to use anymore, all of a sudden it touched this, and now you can't do this as well, right? And so, now there are none of the Krenos-born werewolves. So what does that mean? And how does that kind of tick back up the cascade there? The Umbra. What does it mean to go into the Umbra? Things like Pentex. Pentex is I was recently working on. Do we even need Pentex anymore? Like, look at all these awful real world mega corporations. And so now, we're using Pentex a different way. So yeah,
I always found Pentex fascinating because it almost felt like it was an imagination of what companies could do without the realization they were. Because they were doing all of the things Pentex were already being described as doing. And in some respects, because it came before that vast awareness, it was almost precognitive in some respect, even though it was blatantly obvious that what it was suggesting was happening was already happening. Yeah. So I can see why that would be, we need to change that. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll move on to Kalashandra's question. So do you feel the best way to play a PC monster is to examine what humanizes them despite what they are?
Short answer, yes. More substantial answer, that's the reason that there are systems like Humanity, and Humanity even, I think, got an upgrade in the 5th edition because it is tied to things like your touchstones, right? These are the people who let you still relate to the world. A vampire who has no touchstones, what is keeping you grounded with the greater world, and why you're just this kind of monster who sees people as cattle, etc. But even further, going into things like chronicle tenets, when we decide as we get a chronicle started, we're going to tell a story about this, and losing your humanity is very up at the forefront, or always avenge a slight. You're kind of building these pillars around which you want to illustrate the story. And so as you start to challenge those, that's when your humanity starts to come into risk, and you start paying these costs. You start having these consequences for being the monster that you are.
Simon Bastian's one of our Patreons just says he can't sign into YouTube for some reason. So just in case you see it, I have a question, and sorry if it's been covered, and you've covered it a little bit, but maybe just a direct answer to the question. Will there be an overarching meta plot in 5th edition like in the earlier ones?
This is, I guess, a degree of a nuanced question. Again, the simple answer here is no, it doesn't work the same way. The way we're approaching this for the 5th edition is with the phrase, it's always now. So when a book comes out, that's what's happening now. And what we're not doing is, kind of previously, there was Chicago by Night, right? One of the classic great vampire chronicles. And then there was Under a Blood Red Moon, and these awful things happen. And then comes Chicago by Night 2nd edition, and all of a sudden half the vampires are gone because the werewolves killed them all in the previous supplement. And so what this does is it kind of creates points of friction at each level there where, I get this book and all of a sudden, well, I don't understand what happened here. So, there's this kind of, it's a place for players to churn out because they feel left behind by it. And again, we would rather go broad. And so, for the 5th edition, it's always now. So here's what Chicago is like now in the 5th edition. And then, another book comes out later. Here's what, whether it's New York, here's New York now, or like the game Blood Hunt, the video game Blood Hunt. Here's what's happening in Prague. And it's not now, but it is the thing that shaped now, right? This happened in Prague, and so now the world is the state that it is. And so we don't want people to come into like season 6 and feel like they're lost. Again, you are always welcome once you find the secret room. So it's less of an evolving meta plot and more of a kind of widening of the lens that perceives the world of darkness. And so, there's certain challenges to this. Things like, obviously it doesn't preclude linear media, right? Like if you're reading the Winter's Teeth comic book, here's 6 books that obviously are sequential. This happens, then this happens, then this happens. But if we look at Winter's Teeth as here's this event, here's what, the Twin Cities are like in the world of darkness now, boom, they tell their story and there it is. And so, the meta plot existed in the past because we were a publishing company. We were, kind of evolving these kind of periodicals. And now we're just kind of pulling back the lens and you get to see more and more of the world of darkness.
In some ways it makes it more open and more welcoming, and there's less potential gatekeeping, and it's not necessarily intentional gatekeeping, but it can be quite intimidating to come into a setting where everyone knows this whole, like years and years worth of history that's happened right now, and you kind of feel like you're constantly having to catch up.
The most important part about it to me is in our role developing brand, it is not our responsibility to tell the stories. Your stories are the cool ones, right?
Yeah.
And we are building, I'm helping build the kind of fishbowl. All this happens in this terrarium, right? And here's this cool terrarium, and this is a cool terrarium, right? Great, awesome. Now tell your story. Whether your story is happening at your game table, or whether it's something you're doing on TikTok, or whether you are developing a $50 million budget video game telling your story, these aren't my stories to tell. These are literally everyone else's stories to tell. You're mute.
Andy, you're on mute. I don't know why.
There we go. Let's unmute myself. It's because I was tapping away in a message. Yeah, I think that speaks directly to what role-playing games are at heart, and that is a host of tools for you to tell stories.
Yeah.
And I think in many respects, this just dials the world of darkness back to what it needs to be, which is a host of tools for you to take home, tell your own stories. If you want stories, read a novel or play a game, or involve yourself in someone else's story. Watch a streamed channel, which is playing this game and telling you what's happening in that individual city. They are the stories, or the stories you make at home. The rule books are there for all the tools for you to build your stories. Mm-hmm. Per se. So it is, I think, exactly as the now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Graham, I noticed you put your thumbs up to Kilishandra's question that Justin had answered. Did you want to come back on this one? Do you feel the best way to play a PC monster is to examine what humanizes them despite what they are?
Absolutely, because if you play any character, monstrous or otherwise, you have to have a point of connection with him. You have to have something in common. They have to be an expression of some part of you. And that's the one thing. So, yes, you have to examine what humanizes them despite their being a monster. And the other side of that coin is the emotional stakes, because, if you're just, as we've said before, if you're just running around doing appalling things, completely scot-free, that gets boring really, really quickly. And the thing I've always liked about Vampire and the World of Darkness games since the very beginning was that there were these stakes to balance the powers and the situations.
Here's another one from Roderick, directly for you, Justin. Why is Mage the Ascension the best World of Darkness game and my nemesis?
Roderick, I can't answer why it is your nemesis. I don't know that much about you personally. I hope it goes well for you in the future. Mage for me was the game that I came into the World of Darkness with, and so kind of going back to one of the earlier questions. When I was younger, I played RPGs, and then I moved out of them for a little while, and then a woman I was dating got me back into them. Right, I got reintroduced to tabletop RPGs because I was dating this woman who was also interested in Anne Rice. She says, "Oh, like here's this role-playing game, and you get to be the vampires and monsters." Like, oh, I know what that stuff is. And so my reintroduction to it was kind of that. Was that story there about the gender representation, but the one that spoke to me right out of the gate was Mage. I always loved the kind of gothic aesthetic of the vampires, and the kind of all of the music quotes spoke to me as well. But I really loved the idea out there that this is our reality, not because it's true, but because we have allowed it to become that. And so, Mage 5th edition is definitely further down the line, and I'm sure will take even longer than Werewolf to do. But, again, bringing everything back to that original perspective of not necessarily consensual reality, but the reality that we have allowed to emerge. I very much see the Mage characters as these similar to the kind of young vampires here. They've been born into this world, and they've discovered they have this magical potential, and oh, look what the assholes who came before us did with it. Right. And so like you have all this potential, this opportunity to change it for the better, but better is very much in quotes there, right? So
Yeah. Mage is one, if you think like Werewolf was kind of before its time, in the sense that so much of the issues that it almost predicted in terms of the climate change, etc., has arrived. I think Mage in some ways was ahead of its time in where we are now, with deepfakes, with social media, with a narrative, especially with like TikTok, that goes so quickly, that goes so fast, the narrative changes so much, and then that becomes the thing that everybody believes, and everyone is like right in it right now. It's a very, and I probably didn't really think about that or didn't see that until the last time we had a bit of a World of Darkness chat. But there's definitely some element of we're in a very different place now than we were when Mage was first published, in terms of people's ability to shape reality and tell their own stories, and tell their own fake stories in some cases.
And I think the impact that very small groups or farms or whatever you've got out there can have on the wider narrative is extraordinary. Even if we just look at our very small little world in role-playing games, where you release a role-playing game and the people who may have an issue with it, there might only be 7, there might only be 8, but what a massive impact that they might be able to make upon the overall conversation if they're the ones that are jumping into every chat, if they're the ones that are jumping into every room. And that, on the far bigger scale, is, well, it's definitely a tale that's worth examining. And I think of anyone, I would be very much looking forward to that game.
Yeah, I Darker Days Radio has strong feelings about the technocracy in Modern Nights. I do too, and many a night I've just turned to Andy and said they just won, didn't they? Like the technocracy, they just did it. It's just done. Yeah. That's where we are now. Right. So I think I've timed it perfectly tonight. I feel good about myself. You'll all be pleased to know. Andy most of all, because he has to live with me. So Killishandra asks, isn't it better to design a fresh system to properly examine what it is to be a monster, or do you think appending monster play stats to an existing RPG is enough?
Obviously, from the World of Darkness perspective, it's all custom built to showcase those aspects of the monster, of the costs, and what you're giving up to be the monster. I think really it depends on what the player wants. If you want to be a monster and not necessarily have those costs, if it's, if you want to be, a mind flayer in D&D, sure, go do that. It's definitely going to be a very different experience than you get from playing the vampire in Vampire the Masquerade. So ultimately, I think this one comes down to choosing the game that's right for you. And if you want something that looks at these costs, I think it's very much better to build the system that focuses on those costs. You can always kind of, again, reskin anything to be what you want and get, some of that. If I'm going to be the mind flayer in D&D and we all go into town, people are going to react to me in a certain way, right? But if different costs are going to be what comes up, I really think you build a system from the ground up to emphasize that. If Vampire didn't have humanity, but instead had, the alignment grid, it'd be a very different game.
Actually, there's a lot of chat in the comments that we can't get into, but there's big debate. But it ends with Darker Days Radio saying, so honestly, I don't think the technocracy won. Just in terms of anti-vax and some of the anti-technology traditions, I think he does actually have a really good point there.
But he's wrong.
Yeah.
This honestly goes, I think, to a couple of different points. Like the difference between the technocracy and the traditions is less about I believe in crystals and you believe in science. It is the Cressy appendix there. This is the organization that's exerting control. And so, it doesn't mean that you have to be, you go hug a tree and that makes you think you feel better for the traditions, right? The difference is not science versus new age whatever. The difference is these are the groups that are, I'm in power and I'm dictating what's true and I'm hoarding all the money and I'm hoarding all the influence and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's propaganda, right? You believe in crystal hippie bullshit. I now control the narrative too, right? And so that's why, the technocracy is such a threat.
Yeah, agreed. And moving back to this one, again, agreed. If you were adding yourself some monster play stats, so let's say, for example, on the Warhammer side, you play Ratman, you play Skaven, Die Manling, that without attendant rules to explain what Skaven society is, and the impact that has on your actions means that you can very easily just fall into a farce of a game. Because it becomes, yes, exactly that. Because you need defining lines, which humanity spoke to directly for Vampire, which for Werewolf it had its own systems, which for Mage had its own systems. The underlying difference between the World of Darkness games and that particular question is the World of Darkness is often humanity plus. So you're the monster that was once human and now no longer is. So you always have that anchor. And if you're playing something as a monster, your Mind Flayer or your Skaven, not your cultists, you're looking at your proper other species, something that's different. It requires very clear guidelines, and I would argue almost certainly a proper system to support it, because without it, you've got no point of contact. You've got no empathy. You don't understand what it is to be that in comparison to what it is being you. And without those lines, you almost certainly will fall into a parody, a stereotype that no longer sounds like something that's real. So my general position would be yes. And if you're adding monster play rules, make sure it's not just a set of stats. It's an actual set of rules, guidelines, and discussions.
Thank you. And there's time for one quick answer to this question that Roderick has asked. Is it better to give those with harmful beliefs a place in RPGs since those beliefs are a part of human condition, or do we promote these people if we address them unchallenged?
Yeah, this is always the risk at a table, especially if it goes unchallenged, and it's something that Many people come to play games for, they're kind of not necessarily just a sense of escapism, but a sense of I can change the world for the better. And if you are a person who has experienced racism, or if you have a person who has experienced prejudice, or these kind of institutional grade oppressions, do you want this in your entertainment? I don't know. Some people enjoy it because they enjoy the opportunity to strike back against it. But other people just don't want that bullshit because they've dealt with it all day. So, this is something that every troop's answer is going to be different with. But for me personally, I always want more people to play with. And so if your perspective is those people are bad people, because I will happily lose one of you if I get 10, 20 other people of different perspectives to play with, because the perspective I have is mine. That's all I know. And so the more I learn about different people, the more I grow as a person. So not only is the game more substantial, I feel like you just have a more satisfying life that way. Everybody has something worth celebrating.
I think those are beautiful
words
and profound words to end on.
Very
thank
uplifting.
you. Yeah. Thank you to all our new patrons, by the way. Thanks to our Golden Rooks. And I just want to announce at the end of the stream, before we say thank you to Justin and goodbye to everyone, that next week we are coming live from Chimera, Scotland's Festival of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Writing, where we'll be joined by authors Oliver K. Langmead and Rebecca Zahabi. So that will be an interesting adventure in technological challenges. Join us next week on the road. Until then, thank you so much for joining us today, Justin. Real pleasure to finally meet someone who was so influential in my love of role-playing games, and really just lovely to meet you. I'm going to stop. Someone else can say goodbye to Justin now.
Bye, Justin.
Yeah, bye, Justin. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. This was
Lovely
great.
to
I
meet
love
you.
this. This is wonderful.
We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone. See you next week.
Bye-bye.